board, how many are there of different orientations or gender identities. That's the kind of questions that are going to be asked. So we wrote back to them and said, we ain't going to do this. And they said, well, at the moment it's just voluntary. And we said, well, whether it's voluntary or not, we're not going to give you any information. We'll give you the financial information, but we're never going to give, we're just not going to play this game. We're not going to participate in this ESG kind of index that's even coming to US nonprofits. Now, the net result of the ESG index is that you have a handful of large, favored, and woke corporations, such as Amazon, Apple, BlackRock, Facebook, and Google. And we've seen a hollowing out during the COVID pandemic of millions of small and medium-sized businesses worldwide. And when you hollow out small and medium-sized businesses, you're hollowing out the middle class. And if you want a functional democracy in your society, you need a middle class, because the middle class has the time to run for mayor. They can run for city councillor. They can run for the drains commissioner. The working poor don't have the time to do that. You need a middle class in a society to have a functional democracy. So in the ESG index and in the Great Reset, economic fairness involves massive wealth transfers away from nations like America and the G7 to middle-income and low-income countries around the world. And so we're looking at the prospect of massive wealth transfers. A classic example of that is the Paris Climate Change Treaty, in which we would be allegedly paying multiple billions of dollars to countries like China and India so they can catch up with us economically while we close our power plants, but they're allowed to keep opening more and more of the same power plants. But more importantly, for the purposes of religious liberty, is the question of the corporations acting as agents of the state. And so Benito Mussolini defined totalitarianism. Totalitario is an Italian word, and he defined it that there is nothing outside the state, there is nothing and nothing against the state. So within the Great Reset, the corporations of America start acting as agents of the federal government. And in Britain, the corporations in Britain start acting as agents of the British government. And so what does this mean? Well, we can unelect, or we can elect a president if we trust the voting system, but you can't unelect the chair of Ford Motor Corporation, and you can't unelect the chair or the chief executive of Kaiser Health in California, and you can't unelect the chair of some of your big corporations here in Alaska. And when those corporations act at the behest and bidding of the state and implement state policy, you as a citizen cannot change it. The state policy is being implemented across all corporations, and there's nothing we as citizens can do about it. And so this effectively means that states, as the corporations, when they act as agents of the state, you end up with effectively a totalitarian system where there's nowhere to hide as an individual citizen. So it used to be in America, like 3 years ago, people would aspire to a corporate career with, Kaiser Health or Advent Health or Ford Motor Corporation. And in the last 3 years, I think a lot of people have realized that the best place to be is self-employed and not working for a major corporation, because major corporations are imposing government policy on you, even if the Supreme Court says those policies are unconstitutional, as the Supreme Court did in January this year, or last year. For instance, the vaccination mandates, even if they're struck down by the Supreme Court, the corporations are still doing it, because the Constitution protects us against overreach by the government, but it doesn't protect us against overreach by corporations. Okay? And it's the same with religious freedom. The government, or the Second Amendment, all of the rights we have in the Bill of Rights are the relationship between the federal government and the individual, but though that Constitution doesn't necessarily protect your rights when it comes to dictates by your corporate employer. And we've discovered that during the pandemic. So the net result of the Great Reset is that functional democracies such as Australia and Germany and Britain and America and Canada are being increasingly transformed into compliant populations by globalist corporations, by technocrats, and bilateral agencies such as the World Food Programme and World Health Organization. A couple of other features of the Great Reset that's interesting to note in passing. The Great Reset involves unrestricted migration, or the right to migrate. and the right to migrate overrides your national sovereignty with the right to migrate treaties that were signed a couple of years ago. We're watching the unrestrained monetary expansion of fiat currencies. So we're going to touch on that. We're going to come to that in a bit more detail in a few minutes. But basically, across the West, our politicians are running our currencies into the ground. And this is not happening by accident. They know that the fiat currency, like the dollar in your pocket, isn't going to be around in 5 years' time. So like they're squeezing as much value out of it as they can now because they know it's going to collapse. And they're already planning the reset, the replacement. We'll come to what that is in a minute. The net result of the Great Reset is that people are increasingly reliant on the state for their basic income with various benefits. There's reduced individual economic independence. There are personal carbon allowances now, and vaccine mandates and informal social credit schemes. So I was just commenting to somebody that on my ticket to fly back to Chicago, it actually says the carbon output for every passenger on this flight is 80.5 tons of carbon dioxide, something like that. And so what you realize is that, some countries are putting in place carbon credit schemes and carbon offset schemes. And so if the government starts to measure how much carbon you're putting out, it's only a very short step before they start to control what you put out in terms of carbon, which means restrictions on how much you can travel, restrictions on how much, for instance, meat you may choose to eat, and other restrictions on your lifestyle. And for the wealthy, this doesn't matter because they can plant a 100-acre forest, and that will offset all the travel that they could possibly wish to do. So the people who are going to be most affected by carbon monitoring and carbon allowances are the middle class. The working poor do not travel much. The middle class do travel. People here from Alaska use snowbird, don't you? Down to Nevada or California or Florida. We visit our relatives and so forth. And so if you just look at your airline tickets, they're now starting to track your carbon output. And it's only a matter of time before that becomes monitored, and then it's going to become limited. We also have informal social credit schemes. Now, if you follow China, China has a very explicit social credit scheme in place. And if you don't like the right things on social media, and if you don't watch the right patriotic movies, and if you don't recite the right patriotic logos in favor of President Xi, then your children may not go to college. You may not get a job in a government employer. You may not get access to a low-interest loan for housing. You may not get access to a bank account at all. And so China has a very explicit social credit scheme. We have in America an informal social credit scheme, and it's known as cancel culture. And in cancel culture, if you say the wrong thing, you will be destroyed personally, professionally, financially, and socially. And if you don't believe me, if any of you here work for the state of Alaska, post on Facebook tonight that you believe marriage is only between an adult biological male and an adult biological female, and see how long it is before you get reprimanded by your supervisor, if not fired. And it's the same for Coca-Cola, and it's the same for Toyota, and it's the same for Ford, and it's the same for General Electric. If you happen to post a biblical understanding of human sexuality or marriage or the nature of what it means to be a human being, whether male or female, you will soon discover that America has a cancel culture. It's very, very active, and it will come looking for you. And as a result of that, more and more people in America are self-censoring. People are now afraid to post what they really think on social media because we're afraid of the backlash, the online mob that comes looking for you. And the truth of the matter is that those online mobs exist just as much within Adventism as outside of Adventism, all right? If you happen to believe, let's say, our fundamental belief on the nature of man, which says we're an indivisible union of mind, body, and spirit, which is a denial of transgender ideology, which says that the real you is separate to the biological you, if you post in Adventism that you believe our fundamental belief on biblical anthropology, you will find pastors, educators, students in our colleges coming for you. That's just reality. I know that because I've gone through that. So that's the first thing, there's the Great Reset. The second thing that's affecting us all is the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And I put up on the screen there the first three industrial revolutions. The first industrial revolution was in Britain, 1760 to 1840. The key technology was the steam engine and the railroad, and that led to basically the mass production of cottons and woolen clothing, the textile industry in Lancashire and Yorkshire in northern England. And are you familiar with the song Jerusalem? Yes, that song is a protest song against the inhuman hours that the workers had to work in the mills and for the factory owners in Britain. Then we have the second industrial revolution, which was the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. There were two key components of that, widespread adoption of electricity and the assembly line, and that ushered in mass production, such as Ford Motor Corporation. You can have any car, your color can be any color, your car can be any color you want, as long as it's what? Black, okay, that's a production line. And then when I was born, or just before I was born, we entered the third industrial revolution, and this is the era of computers and semiconductors and personal computing and the arrival of the internet. Now, you know, when I say to my 20-year-old boy, there was a time when the internet did not exist, he doesn't believe me. You know, there was a time when we did not have cell phones. You know, he doesn't believe me. I said, no, really, David, you know, I didn't touch a cell phone until I was 26. I didn't know what a cell phone was before then. But computers really changed the way that the world operates in many and profound ways. We're all familiar with that. But we're now in what technologists call the fourth industrial revolution. And this is where we're seeing the integration of IT systems globally, smart and 3D manufacturing. And this is ushering in global integration. This is the key point for Adventists. The integration of the computer systems globally and of our supply chains globally and of our manufacturing processes globally, it's basically requiring global cooperation, if not integration, along the political and economic dimensions as well, okay? So that's what we're seeing with the fourth industrial revolution. These are some of the key technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. The first is autonomous vehicles. And then there's 3D printing, and 3D printing is really a fascinating thing. If you buy yourself a 3D printer, and let's say you're doing repairs on your car or repairs in your kitchen, you can just print out whatever spare part you need right in your office. You can just print it out. And they're even talking now about printing out prostheses for individuals. You can just print it out, and you can attach it to the human body. We're looking at advanced robotics now, and we're not talking about the arms that make cars. Whenever we think of robotics, we think of those robotic arms in Ford Motor Corporation or General Motors. With advanced robotics, we're talking about nanotechnology, robots that are smaller than the human eye can see. And they perform an industrial task, such as a robot may be inserted in you to implant a stent up your arm or in your aorta, for instance. We're looking at new materials coming online, such as graphene. Graphene is multiple times stronger than steel, and it can be in strands much smaller than a human hair. So new technology. The interconnection of IT is big. Blockchain, we're going to come to that in a few minutes. We'll look at digital currencies. Gene editing. Has any of you heard of CRISPR? Yes. So CRISPR is a technique. It's actually been around for about 12 years now. And the holy grail of gene editing is to edit the zygote. When the sperm meets the egg in the womb, the holy grail of gene editing is to get in there quick enough to edit the genetics of the zygote, so you edit out all human diseases. That's the holy grail of genetic editing and of human beings. And then you have artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is actually becoming extremely powerful these days. Artificial intelligence is not just it cannot just think for itself, but it actually has feelings. And Google fired an engineer just recently for claiming that one of the robots he was making has the full range of human emotions. And so these are some of the things that are happening in the fourth industrial revolution. And the thing I want to focus on for a few minutes, which raises profound questions about what it means to be a human being, is the question of transhumanism. This isn't transgenderism. But this is transhumanism, and this is, some people call it humans 2.0. And so the basic idea, there's one of the founding fathers was Max More, and he wrote back in 1990 that transhumanism is a class of philosophies of life that seek the continuation and acceleration of the evolution of intelligent life beyond its currently human form and human limitations by means of science and technology, guided by life-promoting principles and values. And this is where we're really starting to ask ourselves very hard questions as a society. What does it mean to be human? Because with transhumanism, the basic idea, they come from an evolutionary perspective, is that we have evolved so far as the human race, but we have a long way to evolve. That's the first, that's the basic premise. The second basic premise of transhumanism is that artificial intelligence is now so powerful that if we don't merge human biology with artificial intelligence will make all human life extinct. They have the ability to do that now. The computers may have the ability to crash all planes, shut down all food supply mechanisms, shut down the electrical infrastructure, shut down the power grid. And we know that humans have the capacity to do that. Do you remember when, was it 2 years ago, there was the East Colonial Pipeline in Florida to Georgia just got shut down? A hacker just closed it down, and we were running out of oil and gasoline on the East Coast, this eastern seaboard. We're very vulnerable to hackers just shutting down key parts of our infrastructure. But of greater concern to us is the push by transhumanism that says unless you merge human biology with artificial intelligence is going to overwhelm humanity. And these are very real concerns. Now, one of the most famous characters in this is actually Elon Musk. You've all heard of Elon Musk, yes? When we think of Elon Musk, we think of Tesla and SpaceX, and we also think of Twitter and so forth. But one of Elon Musk's primary passions is actually a company called Neuralink. Neuralink is based in the Bay Area in California, and he's developing implantable human brain interfaces. And now he's starting this out. He's been doing the experiments for a number of years now. He received a license a number of years ago. And what he is ostensibly doing is he's working with veterans. And he's saying, if you're a veteran and you've lost your right arm in a war somewhere, we will put a neural web, that is a web of invisible fibers across your brain, and we will use nanotechnology to attach each web to the electrons of the nodes of your brain. They'll be attached to your brain. Because your thinking is basically electrical impulses in your brain. And then they will read the thoughts of your brain and send that via a digital format from a transmitter in the brain that's implanted there to the cloud. So if I look at, for instance, my cell phone here, and I think I don't have a left arm, but I have a robotic arm, I think I want to pick it up, just the very act of thinking it means my arm will pick it up. So we're actually, Elon Musk is actively looking to merge human biology. And the human experimentation is due to begin later this year. He's already completed his experimentation on rats and monkeys. And so the basic idea, I've just explained it to you, but going beyond this, if you look at the transhumanist chat boards and the conferences, the question is, what does it mean to be human? Now, who are you? You are the sum of your memories and your knowledge and your personality and your character, yes? All of which is stored somewhere in the grey matter in there. Much of it is in your memory banks. And so the idea that's being talked about with transhumanism now is that if we can upload your memories and your knowledge and your personality to a server in the cloud, when you die, we can download it to a newborn child. You achieve functional immortality. You just inhabit body after body. Okay? So this is why it raises profound questions about what it means to be a human being. And when you combine this with gene editing, such as CRISPR technology, which isn't perfect yet, there's still a long way from implementing, on a wide-scale level. But with gene editing, you know what people are going to be doing with gene editing. I mean, designer babies, people are going to say, I want my son to be 6 foot tall, dark, handsome, with a six-pack. Okay? Nobody's going to say, I want my son to be 4'11" and squishy with a squint eye. Nobody's going to ask for that in the gene editing. Really, nobody's going to do that. So what the net result of that is that the human race is healthy, partly because there's so much diversity within the human race. And once we start editing out undesirable parts of that diversity, you're left with a much more restrained, active human genome. So what we're looking at in the current today in our fourth industrial revolution, we're looking at simultaneous breakthroughs in gene sequencing, nanotechnology, and quantum computing. And this is all going to affect us socially, biologically, and politically. And this is a quote from Charles Schwab in 2016. And again, it's worth reading what they're actually saying, because then people say, oh, this is a conspiracy theory. You say, no, read what they're actually saying. You know, Adolf Hitler didn't just start killing the Jews in 1941 out of nowhere. You have to read what he was writing for 10, 15 years before that to understand this is where this is going. And many people who read Mein Kampf, the Jews, many of them left Germany because they could see the writing on the wall 10 years before the Holocaust actually began. And so this is what Schwab wrote in 2016. He says, I feel that the required levels of leadership and understanding of the changes underway across all sectors are low when contrasted with the need to rethink our economic, social, and political systems to respond to the fourth industrial revolution. As a result, both at the national and global levels, the requisite institutional framework to govern the diffusion of innovation and mitigate the disruption is inadequate at best and at worst absent altogether. Now, what's he actually calling for there? A reset, yes. He's calling for a reset in global governance to manage the fourth industrial revolution. That's what he's calling for there. He's saying that today's institutional framework, which is governments around the world and their institutions, is basically inadequate to manage the fourth industrial revolution. We need to reimagine what global governance looks like. So they're not hiding this. And if you read some of his more of his writings, it's much more explicit than that. But basically, the fourth industrial revolution are technological processes that are paralleling the Great Reset, which is the reordering of our economic systems, and it's requiring us and it's pushing us to move towards a global governance system. That's what these two mega trends are requiring of us right now. And this is where we're going. But the thing that really kind of tells us that, you know, we're entering into like really dangerous times are digital IDs and digital currencies. So if you're a retiree living on a fixed income, you may not want to listen to the next half an hour. But so all economies right now use fiat currencies. What is a fiat currency? A fiat is a use of subjunctive. It's Latin. It's from the verb facere. It means to make. So a fiat means let it be. So a fiat currency is where the Federal Reserve, if President Biden wants $5 trillion, they press a button and there's $5 trillion, okay? They haven't worked for it, they haven't manufactured it, they just press a button and they have $5 trillion. The Federal Reserve lends that money to the federal government, and we pay taxes back to the Federal Reserve to pay them for the onerous task of pressing a button somewhere and creating $5 trillion that they've just lent us. So fiat currencies, they're controlled via monetary policy and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is how much taxation, the taxation policies of a government in a country, and monetary policy is the monetary supply. Normally that's controlled by interest rates. So when the government raises interest rates, if you can borrow less money. That means that money is sucked out of the economy. If there's less money in the economy, there's less demand for goods and services, the price goes down. That's how historically we've controlled inflation. Now, fiat currencies such as the dollar, the pound sterling, and the yen are rapidly devaluing today due to inflation and expansionary monetary printing that we see all around us. Do any of you think that your dollar has gained in value in the last 3 years? No. Okay, every time we print or create $1 trillion out of thin air, everybody on a fixed income, such as retiree, is that much poorer. Because there's that much more money chasing the same amount of goods and services. That means prices inevitably go up, and your fixed income goes less and less each month. Retirees, is this true? Your money goes less and less each month. Yeah. So this is what is happening. Inflation destroys the middle class. Why? Because poor people cannot afford to have savings. The wealthy can hide their wealth in non-cash instruments, such as you can buy a Michelangelo painting, and you can buy an island somewhere, and you can buy a Gulfstream jet, and you can buy a mega yacht for 600 million. But middle-class people put their savings in the bank or in some financial instrument. That's basically where they invest their wealth. And inflation eliminates the savings of the middle class, and it concentrates economic and political power in the hands of the social elites within any given society. This is something we've seen in country after country all around the world. From a government perspective, one of the benefits of inflation is it erodes the real value of the national debt, but it also serves as a regressive tax on the poor. And inflation upends what we would consider traditional Christian virtues of what to do with money. So when I was growing up, my mum and dad said, whenever you get a paycheck, after your tithe, always set some money aside for a rainy day. Save your money. But when there's inflation running at 10%, it's economically unwise to save your money. Because if I save $100 now, next year, at the same time next year, I can only buy, that's worth $90. So why would I save my money? So when there is inflation, the rational thing for me to do as an individual is to rush out and spend my money so I can get as much value as I can, turning into non-cash assets, beans, for instance, or lumber, that's just going to go up in price in a year's time. So I turn my cash into a non-cash asset, but if everybody acts in that logical way, that means there's even more money chasing those goods and services, and the prices go up even faster. So it's a very rapidly descending downward spiral when we act rationally with inflation. Now, partly in response to inflation and government control, we see the rise of cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, and XRP. Now, I'm not recommending Bitcoin here today, but basically to say that we all operate under a centralized finance system that we'll call that CFI. So if you want to get paid, you have to open a bank account. And to open a bank account, you have to apply to open a bank account, yes? You don't have a constitutional right to a bank account. You have to apply to open a bank account, and the bank decides whether they want to open a bank account in your name. And once they've approved your request to have a bank account, you can then put your money in the bank. And but then when you go to get cash out with your ATM and you plug in your code, the bank's deciding whether it's going to give you that money or not. And it can give you a number of excuses why it's not going to give you the money if it doesn't want you to give it to you. And if you want to send money from Alaska to your, let's say you have a relative in I don't know, Haiti. If you want to send money from Alaska to Haiti, you have to file a wire transfer request, and then that request goes to your bank in Wasilla, which goes to a corresponding bank in Anchorage, which goes to a corresponding bank in New York, which goes to a corresponding bank in Paris, which goes to a corresponding bank in Port-au-Prince, which goes to your relative's local bank account. So they have these corresponding bank networks around the world. It doesn't go from Wasilla straight to Port-au-Prince. It goes through all this chain of banks, and any one of them can put a spanner in the works and stop the process. In AFM, we have this quite often in parts of West Africa. If you send money into parts of West Africa, it can get held up in Paris for weeks, if not months, and you're trying to make sure the bank passes on the transfer. Now, in response to how the banks have been operating, we've seen the rise of decentralized finance. Decentralized finance is where I'm not going to ask a bank for permission to send you money. I'm going to send you a digital code which represents Bitcoin or something else, and it's from me directly to you, and it doesn't go through a banking system. And that's in that sense, it's called decentralized finance. And it allows for peer-to-peer transactions without the need for a centralized bank clearance system. Now, digital IDs allow much greater personal control over your finances. They avoid currency controls, and they can be used globally. So, for instance, in Nigeria and Ghana, where there are major remittances from migrant workers in Britain or the European Union, people are sending their money back to Nigeria or Ghana in Bitcoin rather than in sterling or dollars, because if you send a wire transfer with dollars, it's going to cost you $30 a transfer. But if you send it with Bitcoin, it costs you pretty much zero. And so every time you send a digital currency transaction or transfer, the cost is so small you don't even notice it. Now, some of these cryptos are deflationary, such as Bitcoin, which can only have 21 million in existence mathematically. There's already about 18.9 to 19 million in existence. So once they've maxed out on the Bitcoin supply, then there's no more Bitcoin. The chances are Bitcoin may surge globally. That's possible, I think. But of more concern to you and I today is the fact that governments around the world recognize that the dollars in your pocket and the pound sterling in your pocket, those fiat currencies are dying in front of us. They're unsustainable. You can't be printing trillions of dollars every year and think that nothing bad's going to happen. You know, the laws of economics will apply to the United States just as much as they did to Zimbabwe, when they were printing and they were giving you like trillions of Zimbabwe shillings for your wages, and by the time you got it home, it couldn't buy you a loaf of bread. Germany collapsed into fascism because the German ruble, or the Deutschmark, basically became worthless. And people were working for no results, and they said, we need radical change. And so our Western governments know that our regular currencies, our fiat currencies, are dying. And so they're spending them as fast as they can to squeeze as much juice out of them, while they're simultaneously developing what are known as CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies. Now, a central bank digital currency, I just mentioned it there, you can have a direct retail CBDC or a central bank backed CBDC, that's known as a synthetic CBDC. We're not going to get into that kind of detail now, but essentially all your economic transactions will be recorded as a transfer of electronic tokens between your digital wallets on the blockchain. The blockchain is a series of dispersed ledgers on computers around the world. Now, what would this do? Well, central bank digital currencies would actually centralize economic power with central banks and with national governments in a way probably never seen in human history. Why? Because the government will know every single transaction that's taking place. Nothing is hidden. And not only that, but central bank digital currencies are programmable by the government. That means they can determine what you're allowed to spend your money on. So Tom Mutton on the screen there, he's the Director of Financial Technology at the Bank of England. He spoke at a conference earlier this year, and this is what he said, and I'm quoting. He said, there could be some socially beneficial outcomes for that, preventing activity which is seen to be socially harmful in some way. So central bank digital currencies are programmable by the government. If the government doesn't want you to buy great controversies, your digital currency will not be allowed to buy great controversies, or steps to Christ, or anything else that the government deems socially unacceptable. So when you have a digital currency issued by the government, which is a programmable digital currency, then your days of financial freedom are pretty much gone, because the government knows everything you spend your money on, and number two, they can actually specify what you can and cannot spend your money on. Now, the US federal government is right now seeking via Congress greater oversight over cryptocurrencies and all of your personal transactions. Last year, the Biden administration was pushing for every transaction in excess of $600 to be reported to the Department of Treasury. Do you remember that? Okay, I'm not sure if it went through, but anyway, central banks would inevitably, with central bank digital currencies, become instruments of government coercion, approving loans and expenditures only for that which the government believes to be socially desirable and for politically approved transactions, and also enabling governments around the world to freeze the accounts of anybody who holds unacceptable views in any given society. And you say, oh, that could never happen. Well, if you're following the news in Canada in the last 12 months, remember the truckers' convoy? And Prime Minister Trudeau said that these truckers hold unacceptable views. And what did he do to their bank accounts and their cryptocurrencies? He froze them. And people who gave to legal protests, they actually gave to the truckers, which was a legal protest. It was never declared unlawful by the courts. Just people who donated to the cause, not even the truckers themselves, but people who donated to the truckers saw their bank accounts frozen overnight because they hold unacceptable views to the Prime Minister of Canada. Now, this is a foretaste of what's going to happen when governments have absolute control and knowledge of every transaction. Now, earlier this year in Dubai, in March, the World Economic Summit met, and there were over 4,000 participants, representing over 190 nations. There were central bankers, major tech corporations, major financial and industrial giants were all present there. And the keynote address was given by Dr. Malmgreen, who was an economic advisor to George W. Bush. And this is what Dr. Malmgreen said in the keynote address, and I'm quoting here: "What underpins a world order is always the financial system, We are on the brink of a dramatic change where we are about to abandon the traditional system of money and accounting and introduce a new one. It means digital, having an almost perfect record of every single transaction of what happens in the economy, which will give us far greater clarity over what's going on. It also raises huge dangers in terms of the balance of power between states and their citizens. So this was at a major economic summit in Dubai just a couple of months ago, and Dr. Malmgren recognizes that with the introduction of digital currencies, there's going to be a huge shift in power from citizens to their governments. And if you were blinking, you probably missed the fact that in about March or April this year, President Biden issued an executive order instructing the Department of the Treasury to move forward with the development of the digital dollar, to be implemented in 3 to 5 years. You probably, I don't know if you caught that in the news, but that's what he signed. So it's coming to America, whether we like it or not. Now, to use a CBDC, you need a digital currency. And so the end goal of centrally controlled digital currencies issued by governments kind of explains why our Western politicians across the West, it's not just the United States, why our political leaders are not worried about debasing the value of our current currencies, because they know that they're dying anyway. They're going to be replaced. So you might as well spend them while you can. Print them out of thin air, get as much value as you can. The people who suffer the most are those on fixed incomes. That means people on benefits and people who are retirees. That savings will be, whittled away in real value. Again, I'm sorry if you're a retiree here today, but this is what happens. When Russia moved from the Soviet ruble to the Novi ruble, the new ruble, the government announced the change overnight. They didn't give the people warning. And because people in the Soviet Union didn't trust the banks, they kept their savings under their beds. And my father-in-law kept his life savings in Soviet rubles under his bed. And he woke up one morning to discover that the government had just said Soviet rubles are no longer legal currency, and he lost his life savings just as he entered retirement. These things happen. In Poland, in the mid-90s, it used to be 4,000 zloty, the Polish currency of the time, to a pound sterling. And one morning, the government just announced that they've knocked 3 zeros off the currency. It's now 4 zloty to a pound, and any currency with more than those 3 zeros was now, any note was now worthless. And people were holding their savings in those large denomination notes. So people lost huge swathes of their savings when Poland switched over, devalued their zloty by 1,000%. So in order to have a digital currency, in order for us to participate in the system, we need a digital ID system. And digital IDs currently in the world are based on what India has done in the Aadhaar, I think that's pronounced, is that pronounced correct? The digital ID system. The purpose of that system in India is to identify the uniqueness of individuals by using biometric technologies. And really the purpose is to bring people from the informal economy into the formal economy. But of particular interest is that the digital ID system unlocks your personal behavioral and economic data to be used by the government and other interested agencies. The government wants to know about your personal behavior with the digital ID system. And so the Aadhaar system in India has been criticized for multiple large-scale human rights violations, but it's used as a template for other countries rolling out their own digital IDs. So in June of this year, just a few weeks ago, there's a working group that covers many African nations. It's called ID for Africa. And that's a platform where Western tech corporations are collaborating with African governments to develop a digital ID that covers Africa. And according to the executive chair in that meeting in June this year, the digital ID is no longer about preserving your individual identity and identity protection alone. But this is what he said, and I'm quoting, "A digital ID enables and interacts with authentication platforms, payment systems, digital signatories, data sharing, KYC or Know Your Customer systems, consent management, and sectoral delivery programs." We say, well, what's so bad about that? Well, your digital ID is interacting with payment systems, which means that if your digital ID is somehow flagged as being suspect, you're going to be locked out of payment systems. This is what they're talking about in the ID for Africa intergovernmental working group that's working right now. Now, in 2014, the World Bank launched the ID for Development program, and in order to fund the development of a digital ID for much of the developing world. And the major country where they've been piloting this is Mexico. And this has been ostensibly is to provide a legal identity for the poor. And it will not surprise you to learn that the ID for ID for Development program, was funded initially by a major donation from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill Gates keeps popping up all over the place, you know, in places where you'd rather him not pop up. But anyway, that was funded initially by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, the ID4D program has its roots in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise known as the 2030 Agenda. Have you heard of the 2030 Agenda? Yes, okay. So the Special Development Goals, or Sustainable Development Goals, they're a collection of 17 interlinked objectives adopted by the UN in 2015, and the goal is to end global poverty, to protect the planet, that is against climate change, and to spread peace and prosperity to the entire globe by 2030. Now, you'll forgive me if I start laughing at such goals, but never mind. This is what the 2030 goal agenda is all about. And combating climate change is a very important component of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Now, digital IDs will enable your local government, or the federal government, or the government in Britain or Germany, wherever you live, to monitor, control, and direct all human activity. All economic activity will be tracked because it goes into a database. And when you combine digital IDs with central bank digital currencies, it allows ultimate control on a global level of every transaction of every individual on planet Earth, either by one world government, or that may not come about, but it may simply be a collection of Western governments who are acting in harmony and collaboration with each other. They can assign value and access to the system for every individual. And access and utilization to the global economic system will be based on your social credit score, such as what you believe, who you vote for, what you like or post on social media, what faith group you are a part of, etc. And I'm not just making this up. If you start reading the technology literature, there are many, many journalists who are secular individuals who are raising the alarm and saying, we are going down the path of totalitarianism on a global level, and it's happening in front of our eyes. Many journalists are saying something that we see where this is going, and it's not good for humanity. Now, if you follow the papacy, you know that in 2015, just before the Paris Climate Change Summit, the Pope issued Laudato Si, which is a papal encyclical on our care for our common planetary home. And the word Laudato Si is based on St. Francis of Assisi's 13th century poem called the Canticles of the Creatures poem, in which St. Francis of Assisi praises God for providing brother sun, sister water, brother wind, and sister mother earth. That phrase, sister mother earth, is also used by environmental groups who are not necessarily Catholic. Many of them are secular, but they're picking up on this language from the papacy. There are 7 goals of Laudato Si. These are the 7 ostensible goals of that papal encyclical. The Pope wants the world governments to provide a response to the cry of the earth, a response to the cry of the poor, ecological economics, the adoption of simple lifestyles, such as you'll eat bugs and you'll be happy, ecological education, if you go to the men's retreat, you'll eat bugs and you'll be lucky. Ecological education, that's a joke, the food was very good there. Ecological education, community involvement and participatory action. And so Laudato Si also calls for climate lockdowns. For Laudato Si calls for the world to rest every Sunday in order to give the world a break from the endless cycle of consumption. That's what it calls for. It also calls for us to rest on Sundays so that humanity can celebrate the Eucharist together. It's in about paragraphs 145, 146. You've got to look a long way through the document before you come to what the Pope is actually saying in that encyclical. But so Laudato Si is the papal encyclical on climate change, and the papacy has a standing cardinal as a representative at the World Economic Forum. And via Laudato Si and the papal influence, there is now a much greater push for coordinated global action to mitigate the climate emergency. Now, probably Biden uses some of that language. John Kerry, the climate czar for the current government, he uses that language. We have a climate emergency, and the only way to solve the climate emergency is through coordinated global action. And so climate lockdowns will coincide, I believe, with Sunday sacredness. The call in Laudato Si is for climate lockdowns on the Sunday to preserve our common planetary home. Now, you may say, well, what's wrong with a climate lockdown? And I would say to you, it may be brought about through on ecological grounds, but within 30 seconds it becomes a moral issue. And why does it become a moral issue? Because if the whole world is locking down on Sundays to save our common planetary home, then those who don't lock down on Sundays to save our common planetary home are actually destroying our common planetary home. Therefore, they are responsible not just for genocide, but for they're potentially looking to kill the whole human race. These people are not worthy to live on planet Earth because they're contributing to the destruction of our common planetary home. And so we find this in the book Great Controversy. The final deception in the book Great Controversy is Satan impersonating the coming of Christ. If you've read Great Controversy, it's in there. And in that chapter of Great Controversy, Sister White says that Satan will be causing all these climate catastrophes like cyclones and hurricanes and droughts and so forth, but he will blame before the world, he will blame God's commandment keepers for these disasters, saying that because they are violating the Sunday, they are bringing God's wrath on humanity. And so we know in the final crisis that overwhelming delusion that may deceive even the very elect, when Satan impersonates the coming of Christ, which we find in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 9 and 10, for instance, when he impersonates the coming of Christ, there will be immense pressure on Sabbath keepers to worship on Sunday for the common good, because otherwise you're bringing God's wrath upon this planet. And we read about that quite extensively in the book Great Controversy, and you read about the parousia of the man of sin that precedes the parousia of the Son of Man in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. So the conclusion of that is that the loss of financial and civic freedoms via the new digital IDs when they're rolled out and central bank digital currencies when they're rolled out. And in America, we're looking at between 3 to 5 years before we have a digital dollar. Inevitably is going to the elimination of vast numbers of civil liberties and religious liberty, because the government will be able to determine how, when, and what you spend your digital dollars on. And if the government doesn't like you or your denomination or what you believe, you're not going to be allowed to spend your money on those things. And so what we see is that if you ever wondered, like, how would Revelation 13 actually come about? How could the second beast of Revelation basically have a global buy, no buy economic mandate on every citizen on planet Earth? Well, it's really hard to do that when we're dealing with cash. But once the world has gone to digital IDs and digital currencies, you and I can be turned off with the touch of a button. So what we see today is that the infrastructure for Revelation 13's economic global mandates is being put in place in front of our very eyes. Which we need to realize the seriousness of the situation in which we live. So we have these three trends: the Great Reset, which is the reorganization of the economic systems of the West; the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is bringing in new technologies that require global coordination among governments worldwide; and digital IDs and digital currencies. All of these are positioning us so that Revelation 13 is now technically possible, feasible, and in some people's minds almost desirable. So everything I've been sharing with you today, I didn't read this in Nostradamus. You just got to follow the financial news, the technology news. If we're watching Fox or CNN and we're worried about the latest scandal or some celebrity's latest hairstyle, we're going to miss what's happening in front of our eyes. But the infrastructure is being put in place for the final crisis of conscience. And it's not far away. So, how do we respond to this? Well, just got a few recommendations. Firstly, I want to encourage you today to position your lives so that the powers of this world have as few pressure points on you as possible. Like, think carefully what career you choose, very carefully. Think carefully what licensing or accreditation you're going to want for your career. So in Britain, for instance, the government has backed off mandates for vaccines for the nurses, but the Royal College of Nursing is now requiring it to get a license to practice as a nurse. So it's not coming through your employer, it's coming through your licensing agency. Okay, so we need to think very carefully. Young people, think very carefully what kind of career you're going to choose. Think very carefully what kind of employer you want to work for. And it may well be that the good careers of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s are actually positioning yourself to be very, very vulnerable to the pressures this world can bear. And we've seen that happen in the last 2 years. So being a self-employed plumber or electrician or carpenter, a skill that everybody wants, and you don't have to be employed by a corporation, is not a bad option to go these days. Okay? So position your life so that the corrupt powers of this world have as little pressure point on you as possible. Secondly, we need to start thinking about preparing ourselves emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And by that I mean we have to recognize, and be careful how I say this, that whichever nation we're a citizen of, ultimately this world belongs to Satan. He's the prince of this world, as per the words of Jesus himself. And if we're citizens of the United States, we need to recognize that the rights we've enjoyed for 200 years aren't going to last forever. And that the nation we may love is disappearing in front of our eyes and it's not coming back again. And that's not a cause for grief. It's a cause for celebration, because the stone that will strike the foot of the statue and wipe away every earthly kingdom is coming soon. And we're citizens of that kingdom, first and foremost. I like being an American citizen, frankly. Okay? It brings many benefits around the world, but I understand that it's not going to be good for long. And so we may grieve the loss of our nation and the rights that we're used to. That simply means that the coming of Jesus is that much closer. And we are citizens of heaven above, Philippians chapter 3, from where we are expecting our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. And we need to live not by the values of the Bill of Rights, but we need to live by the values of the kingdom of God. Okay? So our citizenship, maybe British, American, Irish, whatever it may happen to be, it really doesn't matter in God's eyes. It's of no consequence in God's eyes what your passport says. What matters is whether your name is in the Lamb's Book of Life. And are you living according to the principles of the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world? And do people see in your life the principles of God's kingdom and not the principles and values of our fallen world? Now, I know it's hard to say this, okay? It's hard for us as Americans to kind of accept this. But the prophetic scenario, we can see it unfolding in front of our eyes. So we need to think about disengaging from one and re-engaging with God's kingdom and what that means in our lives on a daily basis. Thirdly, invest in gospel work while you have the freedom to do so. Okay, now we have a missionary family here, David and Brittany Sandvik. Hello, folks. We're delighted they're back here from their post of labor overseas. And when I walked in, I saw that you have a picture of a missionary family from Alaska up on your entrance board there, and the Iverson family working in the Middle East. And I was with them just recently, and Mr. Iverson, that's his name in the magazine, has come a long way. He's got a really good grasp of the language that he's supposed to be working in. And I was sat with him for a few days. He had a number of Bible studies with people from his target people group who come through and meet with him. They had Bible studies. They came for Sabbath worship. They came to a baptism together. And he's working with a local Bible worker. And I had the privilege of baptizing a lady from Syria when I was out there. And a bunch of other ladies were also preparing for baptism there as well. And I want to thank you as a congregation for investing in kingdom work while you can. Thank you. Thank you for praying for the missionaries. Thank you for, if a young person from this church says, I want to be a student missionary, support that young person. Help them out financially, pray for them, send them a Christmas package, and let them know that their service is important. And invest in gospel work. You know, I've come to the conclusion that we're going to be off the internet sooner, probably rather than later. Like the Libertine Health Alliance, some of you are familiar with Libertine Health Alliance. They were just struck off YouTube earlier last week. And they're not sure they're ever going to get back on YouTube because somebody complained that they showed a video of a church service, and Libertine Health Alliance doesn't own the copyright that doesn't have a license, like you have the licensing thing for church. When you sing in your hymnal, all those songs are licensed. The conference pays for the license for us to use those songs. And somebody made the ridiculous claim that Liberty and Health Alliance didn't have a license to show this kind of music, which, if that is upheld by YouTube, means that you could never post a Christian service ever again privately that shows Christian music. I mean, it's absurd, but they've been struck off YouTube. And I kind of expect one day I'll be off YouTube, but I think it's important for us to say, how can we invest in kingdom work in my community and in Alaska and around the world while we can? So things like literature, okay? Literature is a good option because you can buy literature and put it on people's shelves, and they may not read it today or tomorrow, but there'll come a time in life where they're going through a crisis, and they're going to look at that book, like Surviving the Storm or Peace in the Storm or The Great Controversy, and they're going to pick it off the shelf, and they're going to start reading it. And the government's not going to go from house to house looking for literature. So invest in literature ministry while you can. Invest in local ministry while you can. Invest in missionaries while you can, because when central bank digital currencies come along, it's almost certain that books like Great Controversy, because of its views on the papacy, will be declared hate speech, and you won't be able to buy them anymore. So invest in literature while you can. Invest in gospel freedom while you still have old-fashioned dollars to do so. Thirdly, or fourthly, just two more points here, then we're finished. Build relationships of trust with your brothers and sisters. All right? In this pandemic, we had to learn very quickly who we trusted and who we didn't trust. If you hypothetically were giving out ivermectin in your local congregation, you had to know you trusted those people before you handed over ivermectin, that they weren't going to inform on you, that you're handing out a medicine that only a doctor's allowed to hand out. Hypothetically, of course, because this is going online, I understand. So you have to know who you trust. Who do you trust, maybe with your children's futures? Who do you trust to have a Bible study with, knowing that there may be awards given for like the rooting out of underground Christians? Who do you trust? The best way to build that trust is to not just worship on Sabbath together, but to visit in each other's homes, to open up about what you really are struggling with and ask people to pray for you and you pray for them. Be authentic in your Christian walk with your brothers and sisters. Visit each other in your homes. Pray for one another. If somebody's short of rent this month, help them out. If somebody can't pay their school bills, help them out. If somebody's going to hospital, they need a ride, or say before or after the surgery, volunteer to take them along. Get involved in each other's lives and become truly brothers and sisters. Because when all else falls apart, as we saw in this pandemic, it matters nothing that we have an NAD and a North Pacific Union and an Alaska conference. None of that means anything when everything falls apart. Those things basically don't exist to you. You're not going to get any support from them. That's the truth. They might as well not exist. It's you and your brothers here and sisters here in Wasilla. So build relationships of trust while you can. And finally, in case this is really depressing for everybody, every morning choose hope and faith. We carry the blessed hope. You might say it's humanity's only hope, and it's the coming of Jesus. And we know his coming is soon. We know when he comes, every tear will be wiped away. We know when he comes that death and disease and suffering and sorrow will be no more. We know when he comes, all the powers of darkness will be destroyed by the brightness of his coming. We know that Satan will be chained in chains of darkness for 1,000 years, never more to attack God's children. There are many reasons why we may have hope in our hearts. So every morning when you get up, rather than saying, oh no, the world is falling apart, my IRAs are worth nothing, my pensions are reducing in value by the week with all this inflation, choose hope and choose faith. Because when men's hearts are failing them for fear, they're going to be drawn to people whose hearts are filled with the calm assurance that I'm coming soon. As Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. Our hearts should not be troubled by what is happening. We have the light of prophecy to reveal to us what is happening. And Revelation 13 talks about a time when there'll be global mandates where you can or cannot buy according to a certain matter of conscience. And we say, how could that ever be? Well, the infrastructure is being built in front of our very eyes, if only we will focus on what is happening. It tells us that Jesus is coming soon. So choose hope and faith every morning. and don't give in to the fear and despair that is predominant in our world today. Okay? So, just what I want to share with you this afternoon. I've rambled on for a long time here, and I need to be gone by 6 o'clock, I think, Pastor. So, we'll do like some questions and answers. And can we take this offline now?